Liao Zhang had been running for what felt like hours, though time was a tricky thing when you could rewind it. The clock on the wall of the ruined library blinked erratically, as if it were trying to remind her of its own irrelevance. Outside, the dark sky was a painting gone wrong, streaks of purple and green hanging in the air like a bad acid trip. It looked like the end of the world, and to Lia, that wasn't even a metaphor. She ducked behind a stack of half-destroyed books, catching her breath, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, she let herself enjoy the silence. In a world where everything seemed to be chasing her, silence was a luxury. But, of course, that didn't last long. A voice crackled through the speakers overhead. "We know you're here, Zhang. You can't hide forever. The future belongs to the timekeepers." Lia rolled her eyes. "Great," she muttered, pulling herself up and peeking out from behind the shelves. The timekeepers. A bunch of authoritarian pricks who liked to pretend they were the universe's official time police. They had a very specific idea of what time was supposed to look like: linear, unyielding, completely predictable. And they hated people like Lia, people who had a talent for breaking it all. She glanced at her wristwatch, a cheap thing she'd swiped from a pawn shop. Time was ticking down. Literally. She had only a few minutes before the timekeepers would bust in, guns blazing. But Lia wasn't worried. She had something far more useful than a timepiece strapped to her wrist. With a swift motion, she twisted the small dial on the watch, a nervous habit at this point. And, just like that, the world around her froze. Well, not exactly froze. It was more like the universe hit pause. The air stilled, and the noise vanished. She could see the faint outlines of the timekeepers outside the library, frozen mid-step, their mechanical uniforms gleaming like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. Lia grinned to herself. "Another close call avoided. I'm so good at this," she said aloud, admiring the stillness. Then, with a shrug, she rewound time by 2 minutes, just enough to make the situation a little bit more manageable. She walked past the frozen guards, as though she were casually strolling through a museum of utter confusion. Of course, the universe had a nasty habit of not appreciating when she played around with time. As she passed the last set of frozen guards, a tiny ripple in the air caught her attention. It wasn't much, just a faint distortion, a blip. But Lia had seen enough to know that those blips didn't just vanish. They stuck around. She froze mid-step, scanning the room. The ripple was getting bigger, like a stone sinking into water. Her heartbeat sped up. "Crap," she muttered, and before she could move to investigate, the world snapped back to reality. The guards moved again, but something was different. The air was different. It felt heavier. Wrong. And then it hit her. The timeline. She'd done it again. "Not again," Lia whispered, her stomach twisting. The last time she'd messed with the flow of time like this, it had led to an entire city block being erased from existence. But this? This felt bigger. The sky outside was no longer just an unsettling shade of purple, it was almost alive. The city around her had morphed into something more sinister, more controlled. In the distance, the tall buildings were lined with surveillance drones, hovering like mechanical vultures, their lights scanning every corner of the street. Lia could feel them. They were watching her. No. Worse than that. They knew her. Lia stumbled back, her breath coming faster. She twisted the dial on her wristwatch again, but this time, the rewind didn't take. Time didn't bend for her. The world was solidifying in a way she hadn't expected. She had become an anomaly in an increasingly anomalous timeline. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath, running a hand through her short black hair. Her mind raced. She had to get out of there, back to her own timeline. If she didn't, who knew what kind of hell this messed up future would become? Lia darted for the exit, but before she could make it to the door, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Calm, collected, and eerily familiar. "We've been waiting for you, Lia." The words hit her like a punch in the gut. She spun around, heart thumping in her chest. Standing in the doorway was a man in a crisp black uniform, his face half obscured by a mask. But his eyes, those eyes, Leah recognized them immediately. "Zeke?" she asked, incredulously. He nodded. "I know, it's been a while." Leah stared at him, disbelief clouding her thoughts. She remembered Zeke. She'd met him years ago, before the world started crumbling around them. Back when things had seemed normal. But he was supposed to be dead. She saw him die in the last timeline, right before everything went to hell. How was he standing here, looking as calm and composed as ever? "The Zeke who died?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "The same one," he replied with a slight smirk. "Or maybe, not the same one. There's a lot of that going around these days." Leah's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. What the hell is going on? This place, it's not right. I don't even recognize it anymore. Zeke looked around, his expression unreadable. It's what happens when time gets too messy. Things collapse. You've made your mark on this world, Leah, whether you intended to or not. She took a step forward, her hand instinctively reaching for the dial on her wrist. "What do you mean, my mark?" "I've just been fixing things." She glanced back toward the broken remnants of the library. "Or trying to." Zeke shook his head. "Fixing things, huh? That's not what you've been doing. You've been twisting time. And each time you rewind, each time you alter things, the timeline gets a little bit more fragile." Leah felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying? The future you're standing in? It's the result of countless rewinds. You've been messing with time for years. You think you're helping people, but each time you change something, you leave a little crack behind. And now? Now those cracks are starting to break the whole thing apart." She could feel her heart drop. "So this is my fault? Everything?" Zeke nodded, his eyes hard. "Yeah. But it's not just you. You're part of a larger cycle. It's happened before. It'll happen again." Leah's head spun. She wanted to argue, to fight back, but the truth was creeping in too fast. She had always thought that if she could just rewind time enough, she could fix everything. Save people. Save herself. But now, staring at Zeke, the weight of what she'd done hit her like a ton of bricks. "I didn't mean for any of this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Zeke stepped closer, his tone softening for just a moment. "No one ever does. But you're still here, Leah. And the question is, what are you going to do about it?" The moment hung between them, thick and suffocating. Leah felt her pulse quicken, her mind whirling. Time wasn't something she could just fix. Not anymore. She had no idea how to stop this, how to stop herself, but if she didn't try, if she didn't do something, the world she knew, the world she wanted to return to, would be lost forever. "I need to fix this," she said, her voice steadier now, though her hands trembled. "I need to undo it. All of it." Zeke raised an eyebrow. "You can't undo it, Leah. You can't fix this with a few rewinds. The system's too far gone for that." Leah looked at him, determination hardening in her chest. "Then I'll burn it all down." Zeke chuckled darkly, as if he'd been waiting for her to say that. That's the spirit. Leah didn't have a plan, not really. But when had she ever? The only thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't let this future stand. It didn't matter if she had to burn down the whole damn thing to set things right. She'd already made enough mistakes to know that sometimes, the only way to fix something was to break it first. Zeke's eyes gleamed with something she couldn't quite place. Was it admiration? Resignation? He was always hard to read, but there was no mistaking the way he sized her up now. He was calculating, trying to figure out what she'd do next. And Leah wasn't sure she had an answer, but she wasn't going to back down either. "All right, Zeke," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts crashing around her. You want to help me burn it all down? Then let's go. Zeke's smile was a slow curve. You don't know what you're asking, Leah. The timekeepers have eyes everywhere. You think a few glitches and rewinds will get you past them? It's a little more complicated than that. Then tell me what we need to do, Leah shot back, her impatience creeping into her words. I've been dealing with this for too long to keep playing nice. He nodded, as if he'd expected this response. He took a step toward the door and paused, his hand hovering over the rusted handle. You're sure about this? Leah glanced over her shoulder at the darkened horizon, where the flickering lights of drones dotted the sky like ghosts. This was her fault. She had a hand in all of this. And no matter how much she hated it, she had to take responsibility. She had no other choice but to try. I don't have time to second-guess myself. Zeke pushed the door open. The stale air of the city outside hit her like a slap. It was thick with the kind of metallic tension only a world controlled by omnipresent surveillance could generate. The streets were empty, save for the occasional drone hovering silently above, scanning every inch of the block. For a moment, Leah felt like a rat in a cage, but that was the thing about rats, they always found a way out, they didn't speak as they moved through the narrow alleyways. Zeke led the way, his eyes darting around, as if expecting something, or someone, to jump out at them. Leah followed close behind, her mind still spinning, trying to process everything. They couldn't just walk into the timekeeper's compound and start setting fire to their operations. No, they needed a plan, something smarter. Zeke stopped abruptly in front of a rusted door tucked away behind a pile of old crates. Without a word, he knelt down and slid a small device from his belt. He tapped it against the door, and the locks clicked open, the heavy metal swinging inward. Get in, Zeke said, his voice low, tense. Leah hesitated for a moment. She hadn't known what to expect from Zeke's little operation. She certainly didn't think it would involve breaking into what looked like an abandoned storage facility. But when she stepped inside, she immediately felt the weight of it. The walls were lined with strange equipment, screens flickering with static, monitors that showed shifting images, none of them clear. The air smelled like old circuitry, and it hummed with the kind of energy Leah recognized immediately. Where are we? She asked, though she already had an inkling. Safe house, Zeke replied. Or what's left of one. This is where I've been hiding out. You're lucky I didn't burn it down when you messed with the timeline. The more you screw with time, the more these places collapse. Leah nodded absently, too focused on the rows of devices around her. She could feel it now, the echoes of time folding over itself in a way she couldn't undo. It wasn't just her actions anymore, the timeline had become its own twisted, living thing, and everything she'd touched had left behind scars. The ripples were everywhere, bleeding through the walls of this room, through the cracks in the ground beneath her. You said something about fixing the timeline. How? Leah asked. Because I need a real answer, Zeke. Not some cryptic bullshit. Zeke turned to face her, his expression unreadable. You're not going to like it, but it's the only way. You have to stop yourself from ever discovering the time manipulation in the first place. Leah blinked. You're telling me to undo all of it? To never know I can control time? That's right. Zeke's voice was level. You have to stop being the catalyst for everything that's gone wrong. You've created a loop. Every time you fix something, you distort it further. The only way to break the cycle is to remove yourself from it completely. You'll erase every trace of yourself, but the world will go back to the way it was. Leah's pulse quickened. But if I do that, if I forget everything I've done, everyone I've helped, it'll all vanish. It's like I never existed. Zeke's gaze softened for a split second, but then his mask of detachment returned. Maybe. But if you don't do this, you'll never stop the collapse. Time is coming undone, Leah. And it's all because of you. She clenched her fists. He was right. She could feel the weight of it, pressing against her chest. The truth was inescapable. But what Zeke was asking her to do was something she couldn't just walk into lightly. It meant erasing herself, erasing the last few years, erasing everything she thought she could fix. What happens to me? If I do this, what happens to me? She asked, her voice strained. I don't know, Zeke said quietly. But I do know that the world won't survive if you don't. You can't keep holding on to the past. The future is collapsing, Leah. And it's because of you. She looked around the room, at the flickering screens and the hum of machinery, and then at Zeke. He was right. This wasn't a fight she could win by forcing her way through time. She had to let go. She had to let time heal itself. Leah didn't know what would happen to her after this. Maybe she would disappear. Maybe she would simply cease to exist. But if that was the price of undoing the mess she'd made, then it was one she was willing to pay. For once, she didn't feel the need to control everything. Time had a way of righting itself, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to let it do its job. She took a deep breath. All right, she said. Let's do it. Zeke nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. I'll help you. But once you make the decision, there's no going back. Leah closed her eyes. She could feel the timeline stretching out before her, its endless loops and fractures. It was a maze. A labyrinth she had built with her own hands. But now, she had the chance to tear it all down. I know, she whispered. Zeke moved to the central console and began typing furiously, his fingers flying over the keys. The machine hummed louder, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate. Leah stood still, waiting, her heart beating loudly in her chest. Her world was about to change, and there was no turning back. When Zeke looked up at her again, his eyes were filled with something she couldn't place, fear, hope, maybe even a little pity. But there was no more time for questions. He pressed a final key, and the entire room seemed to breathe in unison, the hum reaching a fever pitch. Leah felt a sharp tug in her chest, as though someone was pulling at the very core of her being. Time, her time, was unraveling. The world, the future, it all blurred before her eyes, and then, just like that, it was gone. The world went black. For a moment, Leah felt as though she were floating in a void, caught in a liminal space where time no longer had any meaning. There was no sense of self, no sense of anything, just pure emptiness. She tried to reach for something, anything, to tether herself to reality, but there was nothing. And then, without warning, the blackness shattered. A sharp pulse of light, like a jagged flash of lightning, coursed through her body, filling her chest with a sudden, intense pressure. Her skin prickled. Her mind raced. The weight of time seemed to press down on her from every direction, suffocating and liberating all at once. She gasped, her lungs burning, as the feeling of being pulled apart and put back together again washed over her. The edges of her consciousness blurred, her thoughts, her memories, her identity, all swirling together in a kaleidoscope of fractured images. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Leah blinked, disoriented, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was standing in the middle of a quiet street, the air cool against her skin. The world around her was normal. Too normal. The buildings were still standing, the streets were clean and bustling with life. There were no drones hovering in the sky, no timekeepers marching in lockstep. The sky was a soft, pale blue, and the sun hung high above, casting its warm light over everything. It looked like the world before everything had gone to hell, before the fractures in time had started to tear it all apart. It felt right. Leah's heart pounded in her chest. She looked down at her hands, half expecting them to be trembling or fading away into nothingness. But they were solid. Real. She flexed her fingers, feeling the weight of her body beneath her. She was alive. She was here. But what did that mean? Her mind raced. Had it worked? Had she undone everything? Was she still her? A distant memory flickered at the edges of her consciousness. She tried to grab hold of it, but it slipped away, like smoke curling into the wind. There was something important she was forgetting, something she should remember. But the harder she tried to pull the threads together, the more they unraveled. There was a gap in her mind, like a missing piece, a hole she couldn't fill. Something had changed. She didn't know what. But it felt like she had lost something. Something she couldn't get back. Leah took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her mind. She glanced around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was standing at the edge of a familiar park. No, not familiar, but close enough. It was just like the park in her old neighborhood, back before the timelines had collided, back when everything was still in flux. The benches were old but well-maintained, the trees were tall and green, and there were children playing in the distance, laughing, shouting, blissfully unaware of the world around them. Is this it? She murmured to herself. Did it work? But before she could think any further, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Leah? She froze. The voice was soft, almost hesitant, but there was no mistaking it. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned, her heart beating faster now, her stomach twisting in a way she couldn't explain. Standing a few feet away, a little to the side, was Zeke. He wasn't wearing his usual gear, his usual cold demeanor replaced with a softer expression, one that was almost concerned. But that didn't make sense. If she'd undone everything, if she'd reset the timeline, then Zeke shouldn't be here. He should have never known her. He should have never existed in her world. Zeke, she whispered, her voice cracking. She took a step forward, her legs shaky beneath her. How are you here? What happened? Zeke blinked, then offered her a small smile. He looked just as confused as she felt. You really don't remember, do you? The question sent a jolt through Leah's chest. Remember what? She demanded, her voice sharp, suddenly defensive. I don't understand. This is all wrong. You're not supposed to be here. But Zeke didn't seem surprised. He just shook his head, his expression calm but something like sadness flickering in his eyes. It's not that simple, Leah. You've done more than you realize. Leah took another step back, her mind spinning. What are you talking about? You were supposed to be gone. This was supposed to fix everything. I was supposed to fix it. The smile faded from Zeke's face, replaced with something more solemn. You can't fix time, Leah. You can't just erase everything and expect it to go away. You've altered the timeline, sure, but you haven't removed yourself from it. You never will. Leah's chest tightened. What does that mean? What did I do? Zeke sighed, looking at her with a mix of pity and something deeper, something darker. You've set the timeline on its course, Leah. But it's not like it was before. You can't undo what you did. And the more you try, the worse it gets. Then why are you here? Leah's voice was barely above a whisper now. If I fixed everything, if I stopped it, then why are you here? Zeke met her gaze, his eyes calm, but his voice was thick with something else, something she couldn't quite name. Because you never fixed it, Leah. You can't fix it. You've only made it worse. Every time you play with time, every time you try to control it, you create a new fracture, a new tear. And each one pulls you deeper into this loop. No, Leah said, shaking her head. I can't. I did what you said. I erased myself. I erased everything. Zeke took a step toward her, his face softening with a look of grim understanding. You can't just erase yourself, Leah. You can't erase the consequences of your choices. You've left a mark on time, and no matter how much you try to undo it, you'll always be part of it. The timelines are always going to find you. The words hit her like a slap. She had thought it was over. She had thought that resetting everything would set things right, that she could finally let go of the weight that had been hanging around her neck for so long. But now she realized, no matter how many times she rewound, no matter how many timelines she tried to fix, she would always be tied to them. She was part of the problem. She wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but she didn't. Instead, she stood there, numb, her thoughts whirling like a storm inside her head. "You'll keep trying to fix things," Zeke said, his voice gentle but firm. "And you'll keep breaking them. But one day, maybe you'll realize you can't undo everything. You can't change it. The future is already written, Leah. And no matter what you do, you can't escape it." Her eyes blurred with unshed tears. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to face the truth. But deep down, she knew it was right. "You don't have to do this alone," Zeke added quietly, stepping closer. "But you have to stop trying to fight time. You'll lose every time." Leah closed her eyes, breathing in deep. The world around her was still perfect, normal, untouched, but she knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. She had tried to rewrite the timeline, but in the end, she had only become a part of it, a thread woven into its fabric that couldn't be pulled out without unraveling everything. When she opened her eyes again, Zeke was gone, and she was alone.